The first speaker this afternoon is Amr Rahman. Amr Rahman is head of strategy at Fajr Capital Limited, a principal investment firm registered in the DIFC Dubai. He was formerly the global head of strategy for HSBC Amana, a worldwide business unit of the HSBC Group, serving over 300,000 customers in major markets of the Middle East, Asia, Europe, and the United States. At HSBC Amana, Rahman was responsible for strategy development across retail, commercial, and investment banking businesses across 9 markets worldwide. Previously a consultant with the Boston Consulting Group, Rahman has advised clients in multiple industries regarding a wide range of strategic issues. Rahman is author of Dubai & Company, Global Strategies for Doing Business in the Gulf States, and Islamic Finance, a New Global Player, a piece in the February 2008 issue of the Harvard Business Review. He holds an MBA from Harvard Business School, an MA in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University, and a BA from Harvard College. In 2008, he was appointed an adjunct scholar at the Middle East Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonpartisan think tank established in 1946. Please join me in welcoming Amr.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you all for having me here. As Alex told you, I'm basically a business person, which explains the stuffy suit. But I very much feel privileged to be here with you today to discuss this region, the Gulf region of the Middle East, and to understand a bit better how it could be integrated into the important work that you do here in classrooms. And I was telling Alex when I came that I wasn't sure if he was trying to call me because I had lost my cell phone. So I lost my cell phone, and I was telling him the story. He said, "Well, that's a good story. You should tell the group." Because I lost it in Dubai. I just came from Dubai. I don't live in Dubai. I live in New York. But if you ask my wife, she'll say I live in airports or something like that. So we were coming back, and I lost my cell phone. And this morning has been a busy morning for me because we had a bunch of calls. We're dealing with an investor who's a Saudi investor who is we're negotiating with us some terms. So we've got our company, the Dubai-based company. We've got a Saudi investor. It's being advised by an English law firm. So there's work being done out of London. And then our legal counsel is principally based in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. So basically this morning, and this is pretty typical in business today, is that we had on this conference call, so it was myself in Chicago, my colleagues in London, the lawyers in London, the lawyers in Dubai, the lawyers in Riyadh, and the lawyer in KL. So it's more and more transactions, more and more business is getting that globalized and that international, and I'm sure you're hearing a lot of that in this conference that you're at. Here we go. So what I'll do is I'll speak a bit about the Middle East region, particularly the Gulf region of the Middle East. And what I'll do is I'll speak a bit about what makes it interesting from a global business perspective, and how there are some misconceptions about the region, there are some perceptions that aren't always accurate, and then I'll talk a little bit about, from a business perspective, how companies go about operating in that region. But I'm not sure, to be honest with you, how much of that, I want to make sure this is as interesting for you as possible. So before I get into that, I wanted to ask, how many of you in your classrooms discuss the Middle East in any way? Basically, so almost everybody. Now, if you were to ask your students if you were to say to them, today we're going to talk about the Middle East, what topics or what terms might come to mind for them, do you think? Huh? What was that? War. Yeah? Yeah? Keep going. That's a good one. Let me write these down. Islam, yeah? Yeah, Arab-Israeli? Yeah. Sorry? Suez Canal, okay. Taliban, okay. Archaeology, good one. Sorry? Sure. Food. That's a good one. Okay, that's a good one. Let me take this one. There's, may I call it wealth distribution? And sir, I saw a gentleman. Okay. And? Mathematics. All right. Sure. Let me just ask about mathematics. Do you talk about mathematics in the Middle East and algebra and things like that, or in what context?
They started with zero and they from
Right.
there.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I don't know if people heard that too. Ma'am, what's your name, ma'am? Leslie. So Leslie was talking about how the Arab world originated the concept of zero, and then astronomy, and then also I added algebra. Algebra actually comes from the Arabic word al-jabr, which means to break things down. So break things down and bring them back together, that's algebra. Okay, well that's a good list. And what's interesting about this is some of these are about business, but a lot of them aren't. So let's focus on the ones that are, or let's circle the ones that are about business. So we got oil. War, interesting. Really? Okay, let me put a dotted circle. All right, I'll take that. Wealth, obviously. That's a solid circle. The canal is definitely about business. Sorry? Alcohol, no. All right. Anyway, well that's good. So what I wanted to start with is that when people think about the Middle East, they don't really think about business, customarily, at least as the first set of thoughts. I mean, and it's the same with business people. So a lot of times when I talk to business people about the Middle East, clearly what the things that come to their mind are number one, war. So people say, well, is it safe? Can you really do business there, etc. So war is a very big theme. The Arab-Israeli conflict, of course, is a very important question that people come up with and always raise. The war in Iraq is obviously also quite important. Religion is discussed a fair bit, and there's some good intersection between religion and business, particularly the field of Islamic finance, in which I used to work with HSBC Imana. But nonetheless, that's an interesting theme. And then there are all these other points. Now, we'll get to some of them here, but I think the main thing is that when the Middle East is taught or discussed or reflected upon, customarily it's not from a business perspective, but rather more from a political or social perspective. And we saw that here. I mean, if you look at the very famous incident we had here with Dubai Port. Anybody remember the Dubai Port story? Yeah. Do you remember what happened with Dubai Port?
Yeah, there was a fear that signing over ownership to Arabs would put our national security in jeopardy.
That's right. That's right. So as the gentleman was saying, that we had sold, or there was a company that was called P&O, which is a ports operator, and they had sold their most of their business, actually all of their business, to a company based in Dubai called Dubai Ports World. And Dubai Ports World would then be taking over a bunch of ports worldwide, including some ports in the U.S. And so the Bush administration approved the transaction, and then some members of Congress raised objections, saying, well. And what's interesting about this is the official complaint, if you will, was should we have our ports managed by a foreign company? Which is an interesting and I think a very valid question. What was not said much is that the ports were already being managed by a foreign company, which was P&O. The difference was it was a British company and not an Arab company. That was the first question. And then beyond that, then obviously there were a lot of discussions about this entity. Now, Dubai Ports World was managing ports in Latin America, they were managing ports in Europe, they were managing ports in Africa, they were actually pretty good on the security side, but none of that was really thought about, at least in the kind of general furor. So again, the imagery or the sense was, well, this is an Arab company and we don't want Arabs controlling our ports. So even in business, even in the regulation of things, I think most of the time people are not looking at commercial transactions, but they're looking at political and social concerns. So with that, let me get into the another thing I would say is that this is actually an opportunity. I mean, one way that I think this might be relevant for you in your classrooms is that a different perspective on the Middle East, or a different way to talk about the Middle East, is what it does in the world of business, because it's a different angle which I think a lot of students don't think about much, but it's a way in which it's positively engaging the broader world, connecting with multinational companies and the like. So anyway, when we talk about the Middle East, in the Middle East, I know we have one colleague here from Palestine, so she knows this very well. But the thing, when you talk about the Middle East, first of all, the term itself is very nebulous. So when people say the Middle East, what do they really mean by it? I mean, the term came about mainly in the 19th century. It's a British term, and the middle part is actually pretty accurate if you look at kind of world civilizations, and you can sort of see the Arab world sort of being between Europe and Asia and Africa, and so the middle part you get. The East, of course, because it was east of Europe, and the Far East, of course, is far from Europe. So there's nothing particularly Eastern about it, but certainly being centrally located is a fair point. If you talk to, and if you look at the country composition of the Middle East, you'll find many countries. But if you speak with Arabs, or if you kind of look at the Arab world, there really are three clusters that are the basic essentials of the Middle East. So if you speak to an Arab person, they'll say, well, what do we have in the Middle East? Number one, so the Middle East has a term called Ash-Sharq al-Awsat, which is the Middle East. And then in the Sharq al-Awsat, you have Bilad al-Sham is one part. So Bilad al-Sham, which means the countries of Syria, or the provinces of Syria, which is, I don't know if it has a pointer. Yeah, it has a pointer. We call it the Levant in English. And these countries here, they have a pretty similar culture, language, food, etc. So here you've got Palestine, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, of course, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and so you've got these countries. And the Bilad al-Sham it's a region. If you talk to somebody and you say, I'm Shami, it means I'm from this part of the world, and it means something. Jordan versus Palestine is a fairly artificial distinction. Syria has again a bit, quite its own history, but sort of where Syria ends and Lebanon begins, again, is a matter for debate or discussion. But clearly, Bilad al-Sham has a certain identity over here. And then you have Al-Maghrib, which is North Africa. Now, North Africa has its own characteristics. There's a lot of French influence, of course. The language, the dialect of Arabic is somewhat different, especially if you go to Tunisia, Morocco. The colloquial language that you hear is quite different from what you read in textbooks or from what you hear in the Levant. That's a different dialect. So, for example, if you ask somebody, if you're in Lebanon and you want to say, how are you, say kifak. Right? If you're in the Gulf, you say kayf al-hal, or if you're in Kuwait, you say shlonak. So kayf al-hal is classical Arabic. Shlonak is a nice expression in Arabic, in Kuwaiti. It means what is your color, literally. But it means how you're doing. And kifak is what you would say, which is how are you, literally. So there's different language, but within this region of the Levant it's fairly common. Within North Africa it's fairly common. Then you have Egypt. I haven't taken out Egypt as its own entity, but Egypt is by far the biggest Arab country. It has about 85 million people in it. For perspective, there are twice as many people living in Egypt as in the entire Gulf combined. So it's a massive country, and the Egyptians refer to themselves as Dunya, which means the mother of the world. Which is nice. I mean, basically it comes, of course, they have a rich civilization. I'm sure you all teach it, the archaeology and all that. But also it's such a big country and it has so many influences, and so it's sort of its own cluster by itself. But I've put it in to North Africa for simplicity. Anyway, from a business perspective, these regions are quite different one from the other. So the GCC, which is the Gulf region, minus Yemen. Yemen is geographically part of the Gulf, but it's not part of this union called the GCC, or the Gulf Cooperation Council. You see they have a GDP per capita of about $20,000 US per person per year, which is by emerging market standards pretty respectable. And when you look at North Africa, it's far different. So North Africa is about 6,000, and the Levant is less than 5. Now the Levant includes Iraq, and at the time this analysis was done, Iraq was obviously in a very difficult spot, so that kind of pulls the average down. But nonetheless, you have Iraq, you have Palestine, so you have some troubles in terms of geopolitical issues in this part. North Africa has its share as well, but less so. And economically, it has some oil, it has some gas, and there's a bit of a rebound happening. But the Gulf is a pretty wealthy place. So from a business perspective, when people talk about business in the Middle East, really what we mean from a commercial perspective is the Gulf. That's where the most kind of exciting markets are. From a social perspective, from a historical perspective, from a cultural perspective, clearly those other places are extremely important. And in fact, this is a bit of a digression. But it used to, I used to work at a consulting firm called Monitor. And there was a professor from Harvard who came to speak to us by the name of Ernest May. Anybody read Ernest May? Ernest May is a historian there. And Ernest May has a very interesting theory about how leaders, he's a historian, he talks about political leaders. And his perspective is that political leaders act based on a vision of the world as they knew it in their 20s. So if you want to understand what Churchill did in World War II, you have to look at the world as it was in World War I, because that's when he was a young man forming his impressions of the world, and people generally don't move from their impressions. I think it's pretty accurate, at least in people that I've come across. I think that very much our perceptions are shaped from our early adulthood. The reason why I say this is that if you go to Middle Eastern studies departments around the U.S. and probably around the world, what you'll find in terms of people who work there are customarily individuals who are focused in, it's not here anymore, but focused on the Levant region or on Egypt. Because when these professors were doing their doctoral studies, culturally, of course, Egypt is the home of Najib Mahfouz, the Nobel Prize winning author. It's got a lot of good literature, and so you'd study it. And then, of course, Syria and Palestine and Lebanon, again, there's a lot of good history there, and culturally very important. So there are very few people actually in the academy today who have studied the Gulf, because when they were in school, the Gulf was not very important. Commercially, it's become very important since the 1970s, late 1970s, with the two oil booms. And culturally, frankly speaking, it hasn't had much that's been celebrated in terms of cultural contributions, except for being the birthplace of Islam. So from an Islamic perspective, it's studied and it's understood. But very quickly, if you look at the history of Islam, it was born in Mecca and Medina. So if we go back here, it was born in this part of the world, but very quickly spread, far beyond even the region drawn here. And within a couple of generations, you had the Islamic world being ruled from Syria and Baghdad. So that was pretty quickly the Gulf lost its political importance. So anyway, that's an important, if you will, a bit of a digression. But the Gulf is not typically focused on by a lot of academics in the Middle East. Now, from a business perspective, now I know this session was positioned as a case study, which I think is a good way of looking at it. So what I've done here is this is essentially a formula in general for business analysis. So when business people look at an opportunity or look at a region, what is it that they're concerned about, and what makes them choose to do business in one place versus another? So the first issue, of course, is wealth. Wealthy countries tend to make more attractive markets for business people. So if you sell automobiles, or if you sell soap, or if you sell cars, if you sell appliances, whatever it is, most companies, the first thing they look at when they look at a market is GDP overall, but in particular GDP per capita, which is a good way of understanding whether people can afford to buy the goods that they sell. So that's an important one. Now the Gulf, from that perspective, is pretty exciting. As I said, $20,000 per person per year is a pretty respectable GDP per capita, especially by emerging market standards. To put that in perspective, India is 5 times less than that amount. So India is about 4,000 or so GDP per capita, and China is a little bit more, so it's about 6. It's about 3 times that amount, or 1/3 the amount. Sorry. So basically, from a GDP per capita, from a wealth perspective, the Gulf is significantly more attractive than other emerging markets that you hear about. Where it's different, though, is in terms of absolute size. So there are only 40 million people in the Gulf. That's 40. So 40 million. And if you look at India, of course, and China, they have 1 billion each. So it's much, much bigger market. But in terms of average wealth per person, you find more of it in the Gulf. The second thing that you look at from a business perspective, and again, socially, it's also very interesting, is the question of demographics. So for people who work in marketing, like, for example, Coca-Cola, So the main thing that Coca-Cola tries to do, or Pepsi tries to do, or these other brands try to do, is you try to capture customers when they're young. Because the overriding belief is that a young customer, is a better one to have because they'll consume longer, they'll develop brand loyalty, etc. So when you do business analysis for companies, customarily what you'll do is you'll look at the age group of 15 to 34. For some reason, that's what the pollsters and everyone sort of see as the sweet spot. So 15 to 34, that's the best kind of customer you can have. We'll talk about the demographics of the Gulf in a minute, but you'll see that it's a very, very young population, and that holds for the Middle East as well. More so for the Gulf than elsewhere, but generally speaking, the Middle East is a very young place. A lot of young consumers, which from a business perspective is attractive. From a social perspective and political perspective, it's quite challenging. Because obviously those young people need schooling, those young people need jobs, and they need to become productive members of society. So anyway, that's the demographic story, but it's very important for any market. The next element, of course, for business people is regulation. So the Gulf actually became very attractive for business in the late 70s and the early 80s, but the issue was that it was very difficult to do business there. There was prohibitions on owning your own company. So again, within the Gulf I'm talking about, you could not open your own business and have it be owned by a foreigner. So you needed a local partner, and that was complex. And then there were various laws about what you could do and you couldn't do, and so it was difficult. Now all of the Gulf states have joined WTO. They're getting more and more open, so it's getting a bit easier, although still it's not completely as easy as one would perhaps hope. But nonetheless, regulation is another key factor that people look at. So the reason why I put this framework here is that in any case, if we're talking about the Gulf or if we're not talking about the Gulf, this is something interesting for people to consider is, well, what are the various factors that a company looks at when it's thinking about doing business in a country. All right, here, this is some of the numbers I've already talked you through. Now, GDP per capita is in the U.S. is a very respectable sort of $45,000 or so. And if you look at Japan, it's sort of between 30 and 35. The Gulf, as we said, is nearly 20. Now, China and India, I've already talked about. China is about a third of this. India is about a fifth of this. But if you look at the wealth, GDP per capita of the GCC, it's sort of like Portugal. Right? Now, Portugal is a very respectable country. Don't get me wrong, but I don't know about you, but a lot of young people that I see, when you talk to them about, say, Saudi Arabia, I mean, what do they think about people in Saudi Arabia in terms of wealth? Any thoughts? Yeah. Oil sheikhs. Right? Oil sheikhs and Rolls Royces and private jets and, fancy jewelry and all that stuff. Which, I'm not denying that there are such people. Of course there are. But on an average basis, it's not wealthier than Portugal, Saudi Arabia. And in terms of the social issues or the average man on the street, Saudi Arabia has a lot of issues. Saudi Arabia's unemployment is about 20%. If you take any sort of real look at it, the official figures are more like, I think, 12 or 15, but in reality it's more like 20. You have homelessness. You have pretty big issues there. So it's not to say that Saudi is a place where everybody is wealthier, the streets are paved with gold. But in any case, so this is just for perspective. The Gulf, by emerging market standards, looks pretty good. Compared to India and China, it's a pretty wealthy place. Compared to the U.S., it's not even close. So we're wealthier on a per capita basis than they are. Now this is a nice chart here about population growth, or the drivers of population growth. So here, on one axis, you have lifetime births per woman. So on average, how many children does a woman have? And on this side, it's sort of related to that, is how much the population was expected to grow between 2006 and 2050. So if you look at the U.S., so we have on average 2 children per woman, and between now and 2050, we'll be about 40% bigger as a country, based on projections about how long people will live and the people being born, which is a pretty big growth, compared to other places. A lot of parts of Europe, for example, if the figure is very different, it would be lower because you have fewer births per woman, and therefore the population is not growing as fast. In any case, if you look at Saudi Arabia, it's really frightening. right? Between 4 and 5 births per woman, and the population essentially is going to double. Now this is important because you have a similar doubling effect happening in the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar. But from a social perspective, that's not nearly as troubling, because these are much wealthier states, and these are smaller states, and they can absorb the growth. Saudi Arabia is a 27 million person country, and that's a very concerning figure. But in any case, the point is that from a population growth and a usefulness of markets, Saudi is important, as is the rest of the Gulf, and quite different from the U.S. Now this is a nice chart here about, this is called an age pyramid, and the way, has anyone seen an age pyramid before? Oh, okay, great. So you know age pyramid. All right, so if you look at the age pyramid here, basically what we have in the U.S. is so you start to see the baby boomers here, the kind of the big bars, and then here are senior citizens. And essentially what you see is the population, when you get to this point and beyond, is more or less regenerating. So we have as many people as we have, for example, between 15 and 19, we've got about the same number of people between 10 and 14. So they're all kind of moving in tandem. Now obviously our life expectancy is going up, so the population will still grow, but there's a pretty stable replacement of the population. If you look at Oman, which is just one of the Gulf, 6 countries in the Gulf, GCC, Oman is an interesting example because the single largest age group is 0 to 4. So, and it's pretty remarkable. It's worth pausing on. So the single largest age group in the country is between 0 and 4, and then the next biggest one is right above that, and the next is right above that, and the next is right above that. So here you're talking about countries where a majority of the population, certainly in Oman, is below the age of 15. And the kind of infrastructure that you require, just the social infrastructure. As all of these young people age, they need to go to school. The schools need to be built. The universities need to come. The job training needs to be there. The jobs need to be created. It's a pretty daunting task. So that's an important figure. Yes? I know, that's a good question. I can tell you why, but does anybody have a guess? Okay, it's because in the GCC there's a fairly common practice of expatriate workers. So what you have are expatriates, especially from South Asia, and the Far East, who come to work, and they tend to be men, and they do jobs like construction and taxi drivers and the like. And unfortunately, they're not customarily allowed to bring their families. So their wives and their children are back in Bangladesh or Pakistan or India or Nepal or the Philippines, and the men are alone in Oman. So that's what skews it. Over time, you wouldn't expect that. So if you look at the younger bands, of course, when they give birth, it's pretty equal. It's just that's sort of a blip due to the expatriate workers. So what's going to happen here, I've already discussed this. Sorry? I've already discussed this one, but the idea is that the workforce is going to boom or has been booming in all of the countries of the GCC. I'm sorry, I should have named all the countries up front. Here they are. So there's Oman, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, and Qatar. These are the 6 members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. So the workforce is going to grow, and that means job creation. The flip side of this, though, if you look at places like Italy and Northern Europe, there's sort of a reverse problem going on. And even here, I mean, you hear a lot of the discussion that we have around Social Security, right, is to say that we have more and more people who are going to be on Social Security, and we have fewer people who are working. And the idea is that to fund our retirees, we have a problem because we don't have enough young workers. In Europe, it's even more severe because the population is not growing the same way. In any case, here in the Gulf, it's the reverse problem. So they have plenty of people to work, but they don't have anybody, very few people on pensions and stuff. So they're very easy to support their pensioners, but it's hard to put their people to work. And so, in net in aggregate, sort of the global market works itself out pretty well. But in any particular country or region, you've got these skews. So this is a skew that you find here in the GCC. Actually, before we get to that, I want to go back for a second. before we go to this and tell a quick anecdote about this. I mean, I'm sure we didn't talk about a word here, but you may have come across it, which is sovereign wealth funds. Have you ever come across that word? Has it come up in your classroom at all, sir? No. Okay. Well, sovereign wealth funds, so basically these are government-owned investment vehicles. And many governments, not many, but several governments worldwide have them. So Singapore has one, it's called Temasek. China has several that are making a lot of big investments. And the Middle East and the Gulf region has a few as well. Now, sovereign wealth funds are essentially investment vehicles by which these countries take advantage of their surpluses. They're very big surpluses. So I think we'll talk about that later on, but basically when they sell their oil and gas in the market, they get a certain price. Of that price, the bulk of it over the last few years has gone into savings. And those savings are then invested. So it's a very reverse, opposite problem again to what we see in the US and the UK, where we have been operating at deficits for quite a while. And part of the concern about the bailout packages is that we're perpetuating our deficits. And it's hard to see when we kind of turn the corner and come back to breaking even or having a surplus. So anyway, the anecdote I wanted to tell you is that there's a Kuwaiti entity that I'm very fond of, just because of its name. And it's called the Kuwaiti Fund for Future Generations. And the idea is that the Kuwaiti government said that we are an exceptionally wealthy country because of this natural wealth that we have from oil. And we want all Kuwaitis in the future to live as well as we live. So we're going to stash away some money. It's actually 10% of the oil revenue goes to the Kuwaiti Fund for Future Generations, which is nice, I think. But to this point about funding for retirees versus funding for future generations, it's a very challenging situation in most of the world. In the GCC, that funding retirees is not hard, but putting people to work is. Ease of doing business. Now, this is kind of more of a commercial statistic, but in terms of regulatory reform, how easy is it to do business in the Gulf? You can see that compared with a lot of other emerging markets, it's actually quite strong. So better than Russia, better than China, better than India on average. Within the Gulf, Saudi is more difficult than Bahrain and the like. So generally speaking, some people think it's difficult to do business in the Middle East. And some countries are easier than others, some are harder, but the Gulf region has been particularly strong in terms of its regulatory reform. In terms of oil price, I mean, the wealth of the Gulf, as you pointed out when we were talking about the question, the key terms people think of course, has to do with oil. And one interesting thing about oil is that not only does it comprise a bulk of GDP for many of these countries, but also the more stark aspect of it is that it's the vast majority of government income. So here when we want to, when the government wants to adopt new economic policies or programs, what we do is either we raise taxes or we lower taxes. Right? So that's essentially we play with taxes. We also do things with the interest rate, so we raise the interest rate, lower the interest rate to adjust the money supply. But what's interesting about the Gulf from a policy perspective is that they don't have income taxes. There are some taxes here and there, corporate taxes, what have you, but essentially there are no income taxes. So the way that the government funds itself is through oil revenue. When they have a good year, that's fantastic. When they have a bad year, they have to dip into their reserves. But it's a really fundamental and profound phenomenon, right? Because of course, as you all teach, I mean, how many of you teach the American Revolution? Really? I'm surprised. So few? I guess because you guys focus on international studies, is that the idea? All right. But the American Revolution, of course, the rallying cry behind the Boston Tea Party, which was no taxation without representation. All right, so there's a fundamental linkage between economic support of a government and then your right as a citizen to hold that government accountable. And part of this, somebody raised a question about democracy. Why we're seeing only very moderate forms of democracy, at least in the Gulf region, I think largely relates to this economic relationship, which is that if the government provides for you, and it provides fairly well and generously in a lot of the countries of the Gulf, then the government sort of has this moral authority to say, well, we take care of you, and therefore, as long as you're being taken care of, it's not your place to meddle in politics. And on the other side, the other way to look at it is if you're paying taxes every year to that government, then certainly you will stand up and say, guys, how are my tax dollars being spent? I need you to tell me, etc. In that case, literally, if they pick up the trash in front of your house, it's because they're doing you a favor. Or certainly it's not something you paid for. So it's a very different dynamic between the rulers and the people. And that's a long discussion, so I don't want to get into it more. But in any case, the oil revenue is the key source of revenue for the government, and that's how they run the state. What happens, this is a bit complicated, but just in simple terms, what happens here is that you get the high oil and gas income, and that enables governments to have surpluses. So they set a budget, they have more money than they need, then they have to deploy that capital. They do it either internationally or they do it through local consumption, local investments, and these have two main effects. So number one, the Gulf becomes more important in global markets. So you see Gulf companies buying big stakes of important companies. So, for example, just, a couple of weeks ago, there was a major investment. So let's try and think of some good examples. So if we look at Daimler, the ones who make Mercedes-Benz, that's owned about 10% now by a UAE, Abu Dhabi company. The Chrysler building in New York, where I live, that's owned by Abu Dhabi. A lot of our, Gucci, for example. Well, Gucci's Italian, but nonetheless, Gucci was owned by a Bahraini entity. They sold it subsequently for a profit. Tiffany's used to be owned by a Middle East investor. So a lot of the companies that we're familiar with are actually have significant funding from the Middle East. And even more and I know you're hearing about China and India later, but even more significant is the treasury notes that these countries hold. So treasury notes are the IOUs written by the U.S. Treasury, and they need to be bought, and that's what gives liquidity to the U.S. government. So anyway, those notes, treasury bills, are essentially the foreign reserve currency of the world. So all countries around the world have them, but China has a lot, and the Gulf has a lot disproportionately, because that's where they hold a lot of their wealth. And what that means, sort of in practical terms, is if they got up one day and said, you know what, we're just not so keen about these treasury bills, we want to start dumping them, then as a result, for the U.S. Treasury to continue getting liquidity, they'd have to raise interest rates. So those interest rates would go up. When the interest rates go up on bonds, then they go up on lending. So our mortgages, for example, those interest rates would go up. Our credit card rates would go up. So it's a pretty significant effect that would happen if all of these guys started selling their U.S. assets. So in any case, that's important. But what also you see happening is that a lot of the wealth is being channeled to the local economies to make those economies stronger. And that's what's making it more attractive for many to do business. Okay, now with regards to unemployment, I've already talked about this. In the Gulf, you have three of the 6 GCC countries have double-digit unemployment, then being Bahrain, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. And 3 of them, Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait, have basically no unemployment, very little unemployment. So that's a good thing, and this is why I said before, the fact that the population is growing in those wealthier countries, not as much of a problem, but it is a problem with the first 3. Now this is one misconception that people have about the Gulf, of course, and the Middle East in general, is that women are they don't play a central role in the economy and in decision-making processes and the like. Now the statistic I have here might be surprising to some, but more than half of college students in the Gulf are women. And these women obviously are getting their degrees and then they're entering the workforce. And it's quite interesting because when they enter the workforce, again, this is purely from a business perspective, they are very kind of attractive, if you will, customers, because customarily in Middle Eastern culture, women and men both, but more so women, don't leave their parents' home until they get married. Right? So if you imagine somebody who's working a job, who has a decent income, but she has no rent to pay, she might have a car, she has a cell phone, but basically all of what she's earning goes for her personal consumption. So you find a lot of young women in the GCC, some of them are saving, and a lot of them are consuming, so they're buying nice handbags, they're buying fancy cars, they're buying these things. So in any case, it's an important market. And from a decision-making perspective, there's still a long way to go. So the Gulf, really needs to do much more to bring women into leadership roles and make it easy for them to have equal access. But you're starting to see some very good signs. So I used to work for a consulting firm called the Boston Consulting Group, and we were doing a project in the UAE. And some of our partners were concerned, saying, well, when we send our female colleagues to do business there, how will they be received? And so, first of all, it's a very, if you've seen pictures of Dubai and if read about Dubai, and you'll know that it's a very open place in that respect. But more fundamentally, it was nice because our client was the Minister of Economy for the UAE, and she was a woman. Lubna Al-Qasimi is her name. And she was the Minister of Economy, now she's the Minister of Foreign Trade. So there are women in the cabinet, they have female ambassadors, and it's getting a bit better, but there's still a long way to go. The good news is at the educational level, there's clearly equal access to education, and we're seeing that play out in the universities, which is good. Not necessarily true all around the Middle East and all around the Islamic world, but in the Gulf, the story is pretty positive. Now these are just nice images of products here. These are obviously all brands that you recognize, and how they're marketed in the Middle East and in, overall as well as in the Gulf. Now, one misconception which I think is pretty much going away now, but you remember from right after the post 9/11 sort of days, President Bush used to talk a lot about used to say, why do these people hate us? And the idea that they being sort of a nebulous sense of who they are, but sort of the Middle East, they have a aversion towards the U.S. They hate everything American. They hate our freedom. They hate our way of life, etc. In terms of our way of life, it's very hard to make that case because they consume a lot of our products. Right? They buy our brands. They drink our soda. They wear our jeans. They send their kids to our universities. So in terms of from a consumption perspective, the perception of the U.S. and U.S. brands is very, very positive. What's not as positive, or has not been historically as positive, is the kind of political perspective on U.S. foreign policy. And I think, with the president's speech in Egypt, hopefully that'll be a step in the right direction and things will improve. But clearly there's no mass aversion towards all things American. Not even in Saudi Arabia, which is seen as a more hostile state vis-a-vis the U.S. Politically, but in terms of consumption, the consumption is very, very high of American goods, and that's what we're showing here. This is a nice little image. Of course, you all recognize the golden arches here, and you know how they have the tagline, "I'm loving it," right? Which is let's not like because it's grammatically incorrect, right? I'm loving it with the SS. Oh, he's eating with both hands. I think he's eating with both hands is okay. Yeah, that's a good point. In the Middle East, it's not considered proper to eat with your left hand. So you should eat with your right hand, but you can eat with both hands. That's okay. But if it's only one hand, it should be the right. And same thing with drinking. You should drink from your right hand. Anyway, so this is a nice picture. You've got this is added from Saudi Arabia. It's a Saudi family, but it could be anywhere in the Gulf. And they're here at McDonald's and they're having a meal. And what's really nice about this, if any of you read Arabic, it says, this is from the time of mad cow disease. So the tagline, the headline here is that high quality is our only standard, meaning all of our food is high quality. And then the first line here is that the meats that we use, that McDonald's uses, are halal. I don't know if you're familiar with the term halal. So halal means they're Islamically permissible. So that's a point that they raise. It's actually interesting they say that first, and then they say it is the best type cow meat that is purely 100% beef, so on and so forth. So anyway, it talks about how they don't have mad cow issues. That's really the impetus for this ad. But it's nice because you see this Arab family, you see the boy and the girl and the mother and the father, and this is sort of, it's interesting because it's the, if you will, the American way, but more sort of circa 1955, right? In the sense that not many people today would say that the ideal family outing is a trip to McDonald's. It's sort of kind of been seen as down market, but anyway, this is not so different from the culture that we're familiar with. All right, this is no need to talk about this in detail, but what we have here is the whole marketing approach, so how you customize products. And this is not, again, not specific to the Gulf, so this is something you could use for any country. And you're talking later about China and India, and you could use the same thing over there, which is to say that you, sorry?
We were thinking you were right, it's not particular to the
Right, it's not particular to the Gulf. This is just a framework around marketing. So first of all, there are some products that are not customized at all when you market them. So for example, French shampoos, or French perfumes, Italian purses and stuff like that. I mean, I guess part of the appeal is that this is Italian or it's French or German or what have you. So you actually wouldn't, if you were trying to market that in the Gulf or anywhere, again, China, India, Russia, Africa, you would say, you would keep the marketing as it is. Then you've got this message about, the point about adapting the message. So that's what most goods and services do. I just showed you Pepsi, Coke and Sprite and Crest. So customarily what's done is you'll take your universal branding, you'll translate it to Arabic language because that's important, and then what you'll do is you'll market it with a pretty similar set of themes. So for example, and I have a table of this in Dubai and Co. if you're interested in looking at it in detail. But HSBC, their tagline is the world's local bank. In Arabic, it's Al-Bank Al-Muhalli Al-Alami, which is a basically literal translation. If you look at, there's a really nice one, is I think it was Ford used to have their tagline as drive. It was just drive. And what they've said in Arabic is Tawalla al-Qiyada, or Tawalli al-Qiyada, which is, literally means take the lead. It also, al-Qiyada is also driving, so it's fairly literal. But what's nice about it, if you would say drive, it means siq. You would say siq in Arabic, which is not a very pleasant thing to say to somebody. Drive, it's a bit rude. So they've actually made it more positive by adopting it. So it's nice. Anyway, so that's what the custom is. Custom is to take your tagline, make it a little bit different, and translate it into Arabic. Adapting the portfolio, this is about kind of introducing or sort of changing your mix of products for that region. Now, one thing is, how many of you shop at Zara? Anybody shop at Zara? Yeah. Well, Zara, it's very interesting. So my wife and I we were on one of our trips to the Middle East, and my wife was saying how she really loves shopping at Zara in the Middle East, because my wife wears a hijab, and so she wears long sleeves, and finding long sleeve shirts is not easy if you go to a mall in the States. It's pretty difficult to find kind of long sleeve stuff, especially that's light for the summer. So she always had a hard time. She has a hard time buying stuff. Anyway, when she went to Zara in the Gulf, it was really easy. So it intrigued me, because you go there, you see all of these long skirts, you see these nice long shirts, like flowery prints. So I was surprised. So I said, I really want to investigate this, because this is pretty cool. I mean, they must have done some research or whatever. Turns out it's actually not particularly sophisticated, or I should say it's not deliberate, but it is sophisticated, because what Zara's whole merchandising strategy is that they designed a lot of products, so they have more variety than the Gap or Ann Taylor or other such designers. And then what they do is whatever sells, they make more of. Right? It seems pretty logical, right? Whatever sells in a particular store, they bring more of that stuff. So anyway, so what they found is that these were products that they actually didn't create for the Middle East. They actually created these products for global use. But because they were selling well in the Middle East, more and more of them were ending up on the racks in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia, which was pretty clever. And I think, again, it's that's an example of not making anything specially for the region, but sending them the stuff that works for them. And the last is to create market-specific products and services. And in financial services, we do this a lot because of Islamic banking, which I don't think we have time. I'm checking the time here. We're not going to talk much about Islamic banking. But essentially, it's financial services in accordance with Islamic law. And to create those products, you need to do some customization. So most of the big banks in the world have done so. HSBC, Citibank, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, the whole, almost all the European banks, and then, as I said, a couple of American banks. And that's a way that you can customize for the market. Some categories require it, most of them don't. And that's, if you're really serious about doing business in the Gulf, you can do that. Now, another misconception about the Middle East, or particularly about the Gulf, would be that everybody there is Arab. Now, of course, in the Arab world, the majority of people are Arab, hence the Arab world. But in the GCC, it's really interesting. Half of the countries of the Gulf are actually majority expatriates. Expatriate means non-citizens. So within the expatriates, of course, there's a very large segment of Arabs, but there are also a lot of non-Arabs. South Asians, Far East Asians from the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. So you have a pretty diverse mix. Now the reason why I say this is that if you're a company that sells, let's see, what would be a good example? What's a good example? Let's say, all right, ties, right? So I mean, as you saw in the picture, most Gulf business people, when they go to work, they don't wear suits and ties, right? They wear their traditional clothes. So you would think, well, why do people need to buy ties? First of all, there are a lot of expats who wear suits every day to work, so they need to wear ties. So you would sell your ties nonetheless. And then plus, obviously, these same Middle Easterners, when they travel, they wear Western clothing, so that's another reason. But a lot of the things, if you have an Australian brand or if you have a German brand, you can sell it in the Middle East because there are a lot of Germans and there are a lot of Australians who like those products. Yes, ma'am? Sure. All right, so expatriate, so the question was, how do you define expatriate? Is it first generation, fourth generation, etc.? Now, one of the major problems in the GCC, if you ask my personal opinion, is that there's no process of naturalization. Meaning, you can live in the Gulf for your entire life as a foreigner. And I know people like this, who've worked there 30 years, 40 years. The day their job finishes, they're gone. No nationality, no citizenship, no permanent residence. It's really bad, in my opinion. And it's quite interesting, again, I'll go off topic, but I think it's relevant, is that I happened to be in Riyadh on Inauguration Day in Saudi Arabia, which is interesting. Obviously, I would have preferred to be here in Chicago, or in DC, but I was in Riyadh. So anyway, what was really interesting is all of these people in the Middle East were so excited, as internationally, that we have a fresh face, new leadership, new posture towards the world. So it was overall, everything was really great. So I was speaking with one of my Saudi friends, and I said, tell me what would have happened if Barack Obama's father had migrated to Saudi Arabia instead of the U.S. Where do you think Barack Obama would be today? And to your question, to your point, ma'am, first of all, he would never have been a citizen. If he were born in Saudi, he would not have been a citizen. In terms of employment, of course, he could get a job, but it wouldn't be senior enough level. It would be a senior job, but it wouldn't necessarily be running a company. In terms of politics, of course, no access to politics because you're not a citizen. It's a very different social model. In any case, so to your point, so expatriate means anybody who's not a citizen. Most of them are people who moved within their lifetime. Some of them, of course, are children. My wife was or is the daughter of expatriates who were living in Saudi, and what happens is once you reach kind of high school, college age, you leave and you never go back. So that's customarily happens. But so it's mostly, I guess you would say, first generation immigrants. Actually, it's probably the right term. They're all immigrants, and then few of them are born there, but most of them are not. All right. So that's the GCC in terms of the ethnic breakup. Now, forgive this chart. It's a bit simplistic, but the point we're trying to make here is that if you look at the world's great civilizations, customarily the way they've evolved is there's a sort of what we call sustained institutional development. So to use the example of the UK or Britain, you have the universities, so they established Oxford, they established these various institutes. You've got the scientific method. The scientific method feeds the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution sort of, because they experiment with things, they know how to make machines, they make machines, those machines are more productive. Then after the Industrial Revolution, you've got kind of urbanization, and then there's technology that comes with that. So you've got a pretty stable, or at least the way we've been taught it, you have this development in tandem between economic development and social development. And that's generally the way things work, and these two reinforce one another. What happened in the Gulf, it was a very different story. So you had a pretty moderate level, modest level, I should say, of economic development, and then you had these oil booms. And in these oil booms, you end up with very wealthy countries that don't have the social infrastructure that customarily comes with wealth. So what do I mean? Universities, in the 70s, there were none to speak of. Literally, there was hardly any university. The great universities of the Arab world are in Egypt, are in Damascus, in Iraq. There are plenty of great universities in the Arab world, but they're not in the GCC. They're not in the Gulf. So anyway, they didn't have the universities. They didn't have the research institutions. They didn't have the civil society we're used to seeing, the various associations and the clubs and all that. They didn't have museums. Artwork was there but less developed. So in any case, what you find, and the best example I would point to for this is if you look at Qatar, or Qatar as it's often pronounced, but Qatar, then what they're doing now is they've entered into partnerships with a bunch of U.S. universities such as Georgetown, Cornell, Carnegie Mellon, to bring them over to develop campuses there. They're starting museums and cultural venues. They had these Doha debates that someone was referring to before. So they're trying to build that up. But it's an interesting phenomenon. I think sociologically, when you look at it, you see it here, that they didn't have the institutions, but they had the wealth. All right, so this is more. I'll skip this one because this is more of a business one. The next slide, this one here, is about how companies do business in the Gulf customarily. So very quickly, there are three basic levels that you have. The first, the most common, is what I call here kind of shallow engagement, which is that most products that you find that you're familiar with here, most of them you'll find available in the Gulf, but they'll be sold through distributors. So for example, all of the pharmaceuticals, all the prescription drugs are available, but customarily through a distributor. Then the next level are joint ventures and partnerships. So this is when you go into the market, you find a partner, you start a company together. And the last is when you enter the market directly. Either you go there, you set up your own office, or you buy a company that exists there. That hasn't happened as much historically. It's starting to happen more. And the main reason why that's happening more is that the UAE in particular, then followed by Qatar and Kuwait and Bahrain, they have these free zones now. So they have areas where you can establish a business and own it yourself as a foreigner, and that's making it easier for companies like the banks, like Microsoft, like Hewlett Packard, to be in the market. Tomorrow you're going to talk about the crisis, right? Tomorrow is the crisis day. So I mean, I won't talk about it in detail here. But basically, I talked about these three levels of the three parts of the opportunity formula: wealth, demographics, and reform, what's happening in suddenly in the Gulf, the wealth has been contracted. Now, how much? Really, if you follow oil prices, they're very volatile. So today, yesterday I don't remember. I think it was probably in the high 60s. But yesterday they lost a lot of value. Oil lost a lot of value. High 60s. Just to give a perspective on that, I don't think I have a slide, so let me give some perspective on this. So when oil trades at about $55 a barrel, then Saudi Arabia has enough money to meet its budget. So 55 is break even for them. When oil is trading at 100, for example, that means $45 per barrel of surplus. Pretty significant. If you look at other countries, it's actually much lower. So the UAE is about $25 a barrel. So everything above 25 is savings. And Qatar is even lower than that. So these guys, so basically, the oil price is very important, and they can have a surplus at oil prices in the range of sort of 30s and 40s and 50s. But really, the biggest market by far is Saudi Arabia, and for them it's a $55 or so break even. So it's pretty important for them to keep the oil price above 55. Just another thing on this: the demographics obviously don't change. So it's still young. Whether they're getting new wealth to support those young people or not, they still have them there. Yeah. No, not at all. I mean, I think on that point, so the gentleman was asking about, he was citing some stories about expats who lost their job in the Gulf and then had debts and ended up in debtor's prison. Now, that has happened. That's definitely, I mean, I've read about it as well, and I believe it's true. I mean, I think it's, so that has happened. And it's been very embarrassing, actually. So I don't think it's happening anymore, but it definitely did happen. And I read a story about a Canadian woman. It was very tragic. So her husband had fallen ill, he lost his job, and so that they fell into debt and they couldn't leave the country. I mean, the reason for that, I mean, again, this is not to justify, but the reason for it is that because they have the expats, so many expats, and when the expats leave, there's no claim that they have on their property. So, over here, when you go from state to state or whatever, or you have your credit rating and it follows you, so there's some comfort that if you breach a contract, there will be recourse to your assets. Because these are sovereign countries, if an American goes to Dubai and leaves with a ton of debt, then essentially the creditor will not get his money back. That doesn't mean you throw people in prison, but it does mean you need some mechanism. The easiest things they could do, which would be much smarter, it would be to link up with your credit bureaus back home. So that that those Americans or Canadians should be able to leave, but then when they get back to Canada, they should have difficulty getting a new mortgage until they pay off the old one, which is only fair to their creditors. But going into jail is a bit extreme. So yes. Now, but you talk about protectionism. Protectionism is there, and I think the general trend has been towards reform or openness. Now I'm afraid we might start to see more protectionist pressures. It's not clear if it will turn out that way. There are a few test cases that we're looking at that should give us a sense. The most interesting one to me is in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, they're creating a bunch of economic cities, but they haven't specified whether these would be free zones or not. And if they're not free zones, that means that only Saudis can start up companies there, which would help the Saudis. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it wouldn't be as useful for international business. All right. Now this point here, and this, I think this is more for me to kind of leave it with you as a placeholder for tomorrow when you talk about the crisis. Because I don't know, of course, how it will be discussed, but there are policymakers or government officials have two kinds of tools to respond to changes in the environment. Right? There's monetary policy and there's fiscal policy. So monetary policy is things like raising the interest rate or lowering the interest rate or issuing new treasury bills or buying back treasury bills. That's what's called open market transactions or activities. Now, in the Gulf, they have a big problem with this because their currencies are all pegged to the US dollar, with the exception of Kuwait. So what that means is that the interest rate essentially is set by Ben Bernanke. And this has been historically sometimes good, sometimes a problem. So where it's been a problem is that their inflation rate has been quite high because their interest rates are low. And typically when you have high inflation, what you do is you want to raise your interest rates. But they can't raise their interest rates because they're pegged to the dollar. So essentially the dollar rate is what governs. So that's important. So if they want to contract or expand the economy, they can't do much on the monetary side. On the fiscal side, they have some flexibility, right? So obviously they can scale back or increase the benefits they give people. Politically, it's very difficult, as we see everywhere. Once you give a benefit to someone, the French are having this problem, right? When you give benefits, it's very hard to take them back. So although theoretically there's some flexibility, it's quite difficult to convince people that to accept that, especially as we talked about politically, when you don't give a lot of political participatory rights to people, then at minimum what they expect is whatever benefits they've been getting should remain. So they don't have that much flexibility there. But where they do have flexibility is in government investment. So they can either invest, they can put money into the economy, what we talk about here, the stimulus package. So they can have, and they do have, their own stimulus packages to invest in power plants and roads and highways and other projects that will create jobs for their locals. And that's where they have flexibility. But what's interesting, again, is that if you compare what a Gulf leader is able to do versus what a UK or a US or a Western European leader is able to do in terms of leverage support, they have fewer. And that's it. I want to leave enough time for Q&A. So this is my contact information in case you have more questions or want to discuss anything. But I'm actually more interested in hearing your questions. So we'll just pause here, and thank you for your attention. Yeah.
How does Iran compare with the Arab world in most of the things you talked about before?
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, basically, if you look at these three here, these three factors, Iran, in terms of prosperity, is less prosperous. It does have natural resources which provide some degree of wealth, but it's not as wealthy. In terms of the demographics, it's also a very young population, and so that in that regard, I think it's not as young as the Gulf, but I think you have a similar trend there. In terms of regulation, that's where you have the big difference. I mean, we don't talk about Iran much from a business perspective, simply because we're not allowed to do business there, right? U.S. entities are not allowed to do business there. As a result, most Europeans will not do business there because they can't partner with Americans and stuff on that. So it's a very closed economy, and I think a lot of what you're seeing now in terms of the frustration. I mean, I've never been to Iran, so I can't speak firsthand, but people who have been there tell me that it's a very difficult place, not just because of the things we read about in terms of the religious rules and all that, but just there aren't a lot of opportunities, and people want opportunities. They want to be able to travel, they want to be able to find new jobs, they want to be able to prosper. So I think in that regard it's quite different. But I've never done business there. I can't speak much more beyond that. But those are my impressions. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, the question was about the athletic events that have been held there in terms of golf and tennis, and also in Qatar they had the Asian Games in 2006, I believe. They had to host the Asian Games, so they're trying to build their profile. Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of them, the Gulf region trying to be engage in the kind of global cultural identity. I mean, I think that right now there are, as I think with any global culture or any culture, there are competing tensions. So on the one hand, there's a push to position the Gulf and the Arab world as sort of world-class and sophisticated. So things like, having Tiger Woods go there and play golf, which he does, and he has a golf course over there. So that's kind of a way of positioning themselves as legitimate, world-class, good enough for Tiger Woods. What you don't see as much as from the Gulf is sort of cultural products of the Gulf being taken outside with some degree of, if you will, pride, right? So, like for example, India, you've got Slumdog Millionaire and all that, right? Which is to say, look, this is a Western movie. It won an Oscar for Best Picture. It's about India. India produces culture. Obviously, Bollywood before that. India produces a lot of culture that's consumed outside. In terms of the production of Arab culture that is then used outside the Arab world is not as much, but it happens outside of the Gulf, right? So Egyptian films, Egyptian novels, they are pretty widely read, and people appreciate them, especially in Europe. And within the Gulf is just starting to do that. And the way they're doing it now is they're essentially bringing in expertise from outside and then focusing it on the local market and taking it out. But I think that's going to be the more interesting side. Today, what they're trying to do more of is sort of show that they can attract the world-class events. Yeah? Huh? Yeah. 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 Right. No, and so I mean, the question was about the social aspect, social culture, and you would say your observations, a lot of it seems high-end, what we're talking about here. Now, to address your comment, I think there are several aspects to it. Now, one is in terms of culture. So if your question is sort of to what degree is there a common culture, because you talked about how their expat populations are very large. I mean, what I've seen, and I think what's common in the Gulf is that you essentially have a pretty fragmented popular culture, and fragmented by ethnicity or national origin. So obviously in any country the locals will have their circles, but for example the Egyptians will hang out with other Egyptians, the Indians will hang out with other Indians, the Indians who live in Dubai, for example, it's a lot. I mean, if you see the way that they behave, the way they eat, what they do, it's a lot like they were in India. They read Indian papers, they speak an Indian language. So what's interesting about that is essentially you've got an amalgamation of cultures. What has not yet been formed is really a kind of a common social culture that goes across all of the nationalities. So that's there. Now, what does that mean for business? I mean, you said this is a lot of high-end stuff. There is also the general mass consumer marketing, but the reason why a lot of American companies haven't focused on that is because the market size is not that big. So 40 million is about the size of California from the number of people perspective. So that's why they haven't. If you have to make something specifically for the Gulf, then you may not do it because the market's not that huge. It's not like China or India in that respect. But I think then the angle again is more for getting those. If you want to market to those expats, it's sort of a home country type proposition. So the Indians, for example, or let's say the Russians living in the UAE watch Russian satellite TV. I presume they drink Russian vodka. They speak the Russian language. So that's it's kind of a little pocket of Russia within the Middle East, which is interesting for us. Very different from what we're used to. Anything else? All right, well, thank you very much.